Now all the Midianites and the Amalekites and the people of the east came together, and they crossed the Jordan and encamped in the valley of Jezreel. But the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon, and he sounded the trumpet, and the Abiezrites were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers throughout Manasseh, and they too were called out to follow him. And he sent messengers to Asher and Zebulun and Naphtali, and they went up to meet him. Then Gideon said to God, "If you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said, behold, I am laying a fleece of wool on the threshing floor. If there is dew on the fleece alone, and it is dry on all the ground, then I shall know that you will save Israel by my hand, as you have said." And it was so. When he rose early the next morning and squeezed the fleece, he wrung enough dew from the fleece to fill a bowl with water. Then Gideon said to God, "Let not your anger burn against me. Let me speak just once more. Please let me test just once more with the fleece. Please let it be dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground let there be dew." And God did so that night. And it was dry on the fleece only, and on all the ground there was dew. Lord, today as we consider your word, we ask for your Spirit to do his work, that we would understand, that our eyes would be open, Lord, that our hearts would be changed because we receive what you have for us. Lord, we recognize we're all here from different places and situations, and we're all wrestling with different scenarios in life. And I do pray, Lord, where we are at, you would meet us. And Lord, you would equip us in your word for the work of the ministry. Lord, you would cause us to know you better, to live lives which glorify you all the more. We pray in Jesus' name, amen. You may be seated. In today's story, Gideon will be illustrated as a loaf of barley. And this loaf of barley bread is going to roll down a hill, and it's going to crash into a tent of a Midianite. This little loaf of bread is going to crash into a great big tent. And this great big tent is going to be knocked over and flipped over on itself. It's just going to be destroyed. Barley is what the poorest of the people ate. Barley was also the grain that was generally reserved for the animals. You would go out and do the harvest. The barley harvest was the first one of the year, and that mainly was the grain that they had to feed their animals. But the very poor folks, they could only afford barley, so that's what they ate. It was, in fact, the humblest of all the grains. Barley bread would be the humblest of breads. And when Gideon was first approached by the Lord, he let the Lord know he was the humblest of his tribe, of his clan. His clan was the humblest of his tribe, and he was the humblest of his family. The Lord said, "Gideon, you will go in this might of yours, and you will save Israel from the Midianites." And Gideon basically told him, "Lord, you have the wrong man. My clan is the weakest. In my family, I am the weakest." In Manasseh, Gideon's family was the barley bread. In Gideon's family, Gideon was the barley bread. But in our previous study, we saw that his position amongst his family did not in any way detour the Lord from calling him and preparing him and equipping him to do this job. God proved himself to Gideon. Gideon acted in faith and proved his loyalties to God. And as a result, we saw how one man was changed. God came to him in hiding, and God changed him by revealing his power to him and putting a calling upon him. And he wasn't even an important man, but this is the one that God chose to use. He was changed, and as a result, his father was changed. And as a result, we see the first group that joins him when he blows the trumpet. That's his family, that's his clan. They were changed. And then ultimately, his tribe of Manasseh, they were the second group to join him. They were changed. And finally, all of those tribes around him to the north, they came and joined him. And later on, others would also. In today's study, we see many of these steps being played out. A humble candidate is assured and empowered by the Lord repeatedly. Over and over again, the Lord assures Gideon that he is the man and that he is going to work through him. His actions draw a similar response from others, and they follow his example, and they extend to him their loyalties. And God uses this man to make this initial assault upon the enemies, one which would draw in other men from Israel, and one which would lead to the defeat of over 180,000 of the enemy. In verses 33 through 35, which we read in opening, the stage is set. The Lord is preparing everything for this to happen, for this to come to pass. In a very convenient fashion, the Lord gathers together in one place the Midianites, and then those who are with them, the Amalekites and the other people of the east who are participating in this oppression of Israel. And the people of Israel may have looked upon this gathering and saw in that their own destruction. They may have looked upon these numbers that were more than could be counted, like locusts in a field, and all of these camels. They could have looked upon that and said, oh, this force is too great. We might as well give up. Our destruction is near. But God put them there not to intimidate Israel. God put them all there in one place to do something completely different. He wasn't gathering a bunch of oppressors to come against Israel anymore. That time was coming to an end. What he was doing was gathering an opportunity for Israel to drive out the enemies. You know, for the same reason that you would go to the bowling alley and you would stack up 10 pins at the end of the lane with the purpose of throwing one bowling ball down there to knock them down. God brought these enemies together in one place, and he was going to take that loaf of barley bread and he was going to roll it down there and strike and roll a strike. Now that the enemy was gathered, the army around Gideon needed to be gathered. In verse 34, it says that the Spirit of the Lord clothed Gideon. This is a phrase that we see time and time again in the Old Testament. It's expressed in different ways. Zechariah was clothed with the Spirit in 2 Chronicles 24, and he spoke boldly against the people who rejected God. Similar wording was used earlier for one of the first judges, Othniel, in chapter 3, verse 10. The Spirit of the Lord was upon him, and he judged Israel. The Spirit of the Lord will be upon Jephthah in chapter 11. And even as a child, the Spirit of the Lord will stir in Samson in chapter 13. And then the Spirit of the Lord does not clothe Samson, does not fall upon Samson, but we see that the Spirit of the Lord rushes upon Samson later on in his ministry. When the Spirit of the Lord clothed or came upon or rushed upon someone, they responded in boldness, they responded in power, and they responded in passion. The man who seemed to be timid and humble early on in the story was becoming a man who was bold and powerful. And instead of calling for his death as they did earlier on in chapter 6, now they were rallying around him. You know, it's just like last week they said, we need to kill this Gideon guy. He destroyed our pagan altar where we worship. Bring him out. We want to kill him. And now they're gathering around him. Now he was their leader. In verse 34, his own clan gathered around him. In verse 35, men from his tribe gathered. And then as the messengers went out, men from the tribes to the north of him came and they gathered around him. And then we saw in verses 36 through 40, we get one of the most popular of all Sunday school stories, the fleece that is laid out to determine what the Lord would do. In fact, because of this incident, we use that term, laying out a fleece, to speak of any test that we might give to discern the will of the Lord. You know, should I quit my job and move to Montana and become a trout fishing guide? What I'm going to do is I'm going to crumple up this piece of paper, I'm going to throw it at that trash can, and if it goes in, then it's the will of the Lord. You ever done that? I do that one like every day, but I know it's hooey. You know, should we have chicken or fish for dinner? Well, let's put them both out on the counter. And whichever one thaws first, then it's the will of the Lord that we eat that one. Should I give charitably towards this need that has been placed before me? You know, if so, Lord, as I'm driving into church today, I pray that I would hear Stevie Wonder on the radio. And if I do, then that is the Lord saying that indeed this is his will that I would give charitably to this thing. And since we want to move to Montana and go trout fishing, we take like 5 or 6 shots till finally that wad of paper goes in. And we declare to our families that the trash can has led us from the land of cold winters, led us from this land to the land of cold winters and snowmobile riding and great trout fishing. And since we want to eat fish, we set a thin fillet out next to a giant whole chicken, and we declare it's the will of the Lord that we eat the fish thawed out first. And since we don't really want to give charitably, we listen to the country music station on the way to church. You know, we do that kind of stuff. And it's not really comparable to what Gideon is doing. I don't think Gideon is discerning the will of the Lord here. Gideon already knows what the will of the Lord is. He even states it multiple times. Lord, as you have said. Lord, as you have said. He already knows what the Lord has said. He already knows what God's will is for him to do. It's not like, you know, it's more like the voodoo priests who cast chicken bones and read pig guts. It's more akin to what we do at times. When we say, Lord, if this paper goes in the trash can, then, you know, I don't have to go to church today. I can just stay home and watch fishing shows on ESPN. Now, this isn't to say that God will or will not give you a sign, but if you're using trash cans and radio songs to confirm whether you should or should not do things, chances are what we're doing is we're going to end up doing what we wanted to do anyway. Because we're going to figure out a way to do something that justifies for us, oh, look, the Lord has confirmed that I do this. It must be his will, so I'm okay going forward to do the thing that I wanted to do anyway. Gideon has already experienced miracles. He's already declared his intent. He's already blown the trumpet and gathered people around him. He's like, we are going to go and do this thing. The Lord has said that he is going to give us the victory. The Lord whom I saw, who consumed the meal I put in front of him, who disappeared before my eyes, who proved himself to me miraculously, has said we are going to do this. But he still struggled. He still had fear. I doubt the incident with the fleece had anything to do with whether Gideon would or would not go and fight. I bet he would have woke up the next morning if the Lord said, I'm not going to meet your demands, Gideon. I'm going to make everything wet. Or I'm going to make everything dry. I bet Gideon still would have gone. But what was happening here is that the Lord was doing something special for Gideon. And he recognized that Gideon needed his faith to be bolstered. As the people started to come to town and gather around him, the reality of the situation really kicked in, and he struggled. And we'll see in the next chapter in verse 10 that Gideon was still fearful. Gideon, go, I've given you this battle. But if you're still afraid, because the Lord knew he was, take your servant with you and go down to the edge of the camp and listen. I'm going to let you hear something really special that will encourage you. Even as he sent 22,000 fearful men home, he had to stay. Think about that for a moment. If you're fearful, go away. 22,000 men left. And Gideon's like, but Lord, I'm fearful. Oh, you're staying. And Gideon brought with humility and honesty his fear before the Lord. In verse 36, he confesses that he knows that God has said that he would save Israel by Gideon's hand. Lord, I know that this is your will, and I know that this is what you want to have done. He knows what God had said, but he's asking for something to bolster his faith, and God gives it to him. You know, oftentimes we think, oh, if I show doubt or if I show fear to the Lord, that the Lord is going to punish me, and the Lord is not going to let me have or do what he wants me to do because I have fear or I'm struggling in my faith. Think about it for a moment. Is it really faith if you're not struggling? If it's just really something that's easy to believe, is it really faith? Like when I struggle to believe, that's when faith becomes real. When I'm having fear but I'm going forward anyway, that's when faith becomes real. Like right now, are any of you worrying about your chairs breaking? Like, they're all pretty sound. And I doubt any of you have thought about that at all. That's not faith. Faith is sitting down on a chair that you know is broken, but you're hopeful that the Lord is going to hold it up. You're probably going to hit the floor anyway, but be faithful that God has purpose in it. Has God called you to put away your ambitions of moving to Montana or of eating the meal that's in front of you or giving as he has put upon your heart to give? Has God put these things upon you and you're like, Lord, I want to find a way to do what I want to do and feel justified. So, Lord, just leave me alone for a while and I'm going to make up some way that I can feel like you're telling me to do this. And we totally leave him out of the equation. And we do more of what's akin to the voodoo practices than what's akin to Christianity. If you're struggling with what God has called you to do, then I think we have just cause to ask God to bolster our faith. It's what he did for Gideon. He may grant you a fleece, he may not, but either way, if you already know what you're supposed to do, then you need to do it. Has God called you to give generously to that need which he's placed in front of you, and you know that you're supposed to do it, but you're trying to find a way out of it and justify it, and the thought of it is still hard and painful? Generosity, I understand, it's really hard for some people. Then ask God to bolster your faith. He may grant you a fleece, he may not, but either way, if you already know what you're supposed to do, don't try to make up some way out of it. Gideon's fleece didn't reveal God's will to Gideon. He already knew God's will. It merely bolstered his faith. And I'm fairly certain that Gideon knew what he was supposed to do. And either way, I'm sure he was going to do it. But he was struggling. And the Lord gave him what he needed. Let's look at chapter 7, verse 1, reading on down to verse 8. Then Jerubbaal, that is Gideon, and all the people who were with him rose early and encamped beside the spring of Harod. And the camp of Midian was north of them by the hill of Moreh in the valley. The Lord said to Gideon, the people with you are too many for me to give the Midianites into your hand, lest Israel boast over me, saying, my own hand has saved me. Now therefore proclaim in the ears of the people, saying, whoever is fearful and trembling, let him return home and hurry away from Mount Gilead. Then 22,000 of the people returned, and 10,000 remained. And the Lord said to Gideon, the people are still too many. Take them down to the water, and I will test them for you there. And any one of whom I say to you, this one shall go with you, shall go with you. And anyone whom I say to you, this one shall not go with you, shall not go. So he brought the people down to the water, and the Lord said to Gideon, everyone who laps the water with his tongue as a dog laps, he shall set by himself. Likewise, everyone who kneels down to drink. And the number of those who lapped, putting their hands to their mouth, was 300 men. But all the rest of the people knelt down to drink water. And the Lord said to Gideon, with the 300 men who lapped, I will save you and give the Midianites into your hand, and let all the others go, every man to his home. So the people took provisions in their hands and their trumpets, and sent all the rest of Israel, every man to his tent, and retained the 300 men, and the camp of Midian was below him in the valley. A fearful man was called to stay, even as he sent 22,000 fearful men away. He would still go to battle. And we'll see in a while, those who are sent away, they're going to be called back into battle very soon. Like the next morning, messengers are going to come to them as they're going home and say, never mind, come with us. They are fleeing, and they will come and they will join the battle. Those fearful 22,000, though, they would hear about the miraculous attack. And the cool thing there is their faith would be bolstered. And they would turn and they would go to battle too. So even the fearful 22,000 would have their faith bolstered, and they would end up going to do what they had originally come there to do. Even with 32,000 men. The Lord said it's too many. Even with 32,000 men, it's still 6-to-1 odds. Every one man would have to defeat 6 of the enemy. And the Lord said, no, that's too many. It's too many. If every one man defeats 6 of the enemy, you will boast in yourself. You will not give me credit for the victory. Obviously, many would be afraid, but for 22,000 men to admit that they were afraid, I think that's one of the greatest miracles that we see here. Everyone who's afraid, leave. Do you think anyone actually would have left unless the Lord had actually impressed upon them the reality that they needed to respond? And so 22,000 said, okay, I am afraid, and I will leave. I'm sure Gideon was shocked when the Lord told him that 1,000 men were too many. But Lord, 1,000. There's 180,000 of them. There's 1,000 here. You know, the odds at that point were even greater. The odds at that point were extreme. And still, the Lord said, if you get a victory with 1,000 men, you still won't give me credit. God wasn't thinking in terms of fighting and killing with the sword and coming against them and hand-to-hand combat and one man killing 32 men. God wasn't thinking in terms of that. God was thinking in terms of a miracle. God was thinking in terms of doing something here that caused the men of Israel to look on and see that God was bringing the victory. Not them, not their fighting prowess or great abilities. 1,000 men was too many. So the men were sent down to the water to drink and determined on the way they drank water whether they would go to battle or whether they would not go to battle. And I'm sure many of you have heard the reasoning behind this. A lot of people like to say there's a reason why these men were chosen over these men. Men who lay down on their bellies and drink, they're not watchful, they're not alert, they're not aware. But those who kneel and bring water up to their mouth, they are alert and they're watchful. And those are the ones you want. And that's kind of a neat principle. And almost every commentary I read and every sermon I've ever heard on this passage talks about how the Lord chose 300 alert men. And he sent everyone else away. But the Bible is completely silent on that reasoning. You won't find that reasoning anywhere in here. You just find that 2 different types of people drank water differently. And, and I asked Julie about this yesterday, why would he do that? And she said, well, how would you drink water? And I said, I would probably kneel down and bring water up. And she said, that's because you're a certain kind of person. I'm like, I'm not a watchful person. I'm a person that doesn't want to drink little chunks of wood, and I don't want to get my shirt dirty. What kind of people did Gideon choose? Did he choose the guys who had bad backs and sore joints and big bellies? They couldn't get down there to drink like that. They had to pull water up to their mouth. What kind of men did Gideon choose? Men who didn't want to get their shirts wet? Who didn't want to drink in little pieces of dirt and grass? Men who had bad joints and knees and backs and big bellies? I don't know. It's noble to say that he wanted the watchful, the alert. But in reality, it's arbitrary. God just divided them. And God said, the small group, these are the ones you're going to take with you. So finally, the stage was set for the miracle that God intended. And based on the way that he was doing things, I think he actually did pick the guys with bad backs and sore joints and big bellies. Because that's kind of what he's been doing the whole time. Now your army's too good, I need to make it worse. No, your army's too good, I need to make it worse. No, your army's too good, now it's pretty bad. You got 300 of guys who aren't afraid, but they're the worst of the guys who aren't afraid. Now that's one possible option. But again, the Bible is silent. Verse 9, the same night the Lord said to him, arise, go down against the camp, for I've given it into your hand. So right now, the Lord is ready to give him victory. And we can assume that this plan with the pots and the torches and the shouting and the trumpets has already been established. Right now, he could go and have this victory. But the Lord knows that he's still struggling, that he's still fearful. And so in verse 10, he says, but if you are afraid to go down to the camp with Purah, your servant, and you shall hear what they say, and afterward your hand shall be strengthened to go down against the camp. Then he went down with Purah his servant to the outpost of the armed men who were in the camp, and the Midianites and the Amalekites and all the people of the east lay along the valley like locusts in abundance, and their camels were without number, as the sand that is on the seashore in abundance. And when Gideon came, behold, a man was telling a dream to his comrade. And he said, Behold, I dreamed a dream. And behold, a cake of barley bread tumbled into the camp of Midian, and came to the tent and struck it so that it fell and turned upside down, so the tent lay flat. And his comrade answered, This is no other than the sword of Gideon, the son of Joash, a man of Israel. God has given into his hand Midian and all the camp. He was not a good soldier. I'm just saying that right off the bat. He was not a good soldier. He should have probably been taken out and whipped for lack of morale, but that's what he said. As soon as Gideon heard the telling of the dream and its interpretation, he worshipped, and he returned to the camp of Israel and said, Arise, for the Lord has given the host of Midian into your hands. The miracle has already happened. God is already destroying the morale of the Midianites. He's already bringing fear and dread upon them. He's already causing them to be fearful of this guy, Gideon, who is just a nobody in his family and in his clan just a few days ago. Gideon was still fearful. And even though he wasn't asking God to make the ground wet in a very specific way, Lord, here's the ground, and I'm going to do this thing and that, and what I want you to do is to make this part wet and this part dry, and if you do that, Lord, I'll know for certain in my heart that I'm supposed to do this. He wasn't even asking this time. The Lord knew he still needed it. If you're still afraid, I want you to go down and listen. I want you to see what I'm already doing in that camp. I am destroying that camp from within. I am breaking down their morale. I am laying fear and dread upon them. And your name is going to be, how would they know about him? Your name is going to be known amongst them, and they are going to be fearful of you. He had 300 guys looking at him with expectation. They had each 32,000 men to defeat, each of them. Suddenly the odds were like 107-1. When they snuck up on the enemy, they heard the story of the barley loaf. He heard the Midianites speak of him personally. And this time, they were afraid. Not him, they were afraid. His fear was gone. His fear just washed away, and he worshiped the Lord, and he returned to his 300 guys with boldness and said, They're ours. The Lord has given us the victory. Let's do this. Now, we don't know this for sure, but I think that these dreams and these interpretations were probably a common thing throughout the camp. It just wasn't these guys on the outskirts. The Midianites were already talking about Gideon, and there was dread in their hearts. And in just a little while, they were going to wake up from these dreams of Gideon, and they were going to hear a shout, the sword of the Lord and Gideon. And they're going to hear that shout, and they're going to wake up in fear of this nightmare, and they are going to freak out. And so he quietly, in the shadow of the enemy, worshiped the Lord and returned to his men. Now, somewhere along the lines, his plan was devised. The Lord had shown Gideon how he was going to give them the victory, and they divided up into 3 groups of 100, and each had a trumpet, and they essentially just a ram's horn. It wasn't anything fancy like what kids in band play now. And they each had a clay pot in which they hid their torch so they could approach unseen. So they had a torch in this clay pot, and they had a trumpet, and they went down to the edge of the camp. They divided into 3 places around the camp. And it all started with Gideon's group. He's like, I'll go first, and once you hear us, you guys do the same thing. They broke their pots. 100 guys throwing clay pots down on the ground. And then another 100 over here, and another 100 over here. Suddenly, torches lit up out of nowhere, and trumpets were blowing, and they were shouting the name of Yahweh and the name of Gideon. And these guys woke up from their nightmares, and they freaked out. The camp turned on itself in great fear and confusion. Gideon's army merely had to look on as the Lord performed this great miracle there. They looked up and they were surrounded, and there were shouts of the name Yahweh and shouts of the name Gideon, and they turned on themselves. And those who survived ran. They're like, run away, run for your lives. Next week we'll pick up in verse 32. The fearful are called back. Okay, they're on the run. The Lord has given them into our hands. Let's go chase them down. Let's go win this victory. And so they ran to the east, and they ran over to the Jordan, and they ran south, and the men from Ephraim were called to come up and meet them. And so they were blocked from going south. So they crossed the Jordan into Asher? Yeah, into Asher, and they came to cities there, and they just continued to pursue them and continued to chase them until finally the victory was given, and we'll get into that next week. But in closing, allow me to highlight this one point. And you probably know what God wants you to do. Gideon knew what God wanted him to do. And God's always putting things upon us. Hey, I want you to do this. I want you to step forward. I want you to step up. I want you to take this step of faith, because it's the process of growing us. It's the process of us being discipled, the process of maturing us. He's asking us to exercise our faith. And there should always be an opportunity for us to exercise faith if we're walking with the Lord, because he wants us to be strong and he wants to grow us. So at different times in our life, we know that the Lord wants us to do something. And we know it. We know for certain he wants us to do something. And so you probably know what God wants you to do, and you don't need to throw a crumpled up paper at a trash can or wait for a Stevie Wonder song to come on the country station. If that happened, not only would it be cool, but it probably would be the Lord. The Christian walk is filled with opportunities to step out in faith. Normally, we know how we're supposed to step. As we see with Gideon, God is not opposed to your fleece. He's not opposed to that. But may our fleeces not be things which determine whether we will or will not. May they be there just as an opportunity for God to bolster our faith. The fleece, Lord, I'm going to put this fleece up there because I know that I'm supposed to do this, but I'm fearful, and I'm just asking for you to bolster my faith. I'm going to do it anyway because you have called me to do it. I'm going to step forward and do it anyway. Because as we see here, he is the God who bolsters the faith of the fearful. And I don't know about you, but I am the fearful quite a bit. There are times where he says, this is what the situation you're in, and I need you to trust in me, and it causes me to be fearful. And sometimes he bolsters my faith, and sometimes I have to just step forward like Peter did when he lowered himself off that boat and walked on the water to Jesus. Today I challenge you to ask for that. Ask for your God to overcome your fear and give you the strength and the faith that you need to take your step of faith. So I'd like the band to come forward. We're going to close with prayer. Chuck, will you...